The announcement that the former president of the United States, Donald Trump, was going to be indicted by the Manhattan DA threw a preemptive element of chaos into the 2024 presidential election. That state of chaos exists across the institutional board of the West. Here in the U.S., we're also looking at instability in the finance sector with the collapse of several banks, and that's also true in Europe with the collapse of Credit Suisse. And, of course, there's the looming war in Ukraine and the positioning around that in Europe. We're taking a look at all of that with Professor Tony Monteiro from the Saturday Free School in Philadelphia. We spoke with him via Skype on Friday. Professor Monteiro, thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Pleasure to be with you, Don.
So we're looking at the continuing maturation of a variety of crises, the announcement of a new foreign policy by Russia seeking ever closer relations with China and India and reaching around the world to Latin America, Africa, and Asia to develop partnerships from the economic to the military and beyond. We've got the bank failures that we're still sitting on the edge about those, wondering what's going to happen. Nice chunk of the FDIC's reserves got taken out just with the Silicon Valley Bank, and there's more still pending. And, of course, the indictment of former president and the leading presidential candidate in next year's presidential election, Donald Trump. Where do you want to start?
Well, we have a plate full.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, there's a lot on our plate if you're looking at the totality of this crisis. It is a total crisis. It is a crisis of the undoing of a system of finance and economics and politics that are manipulated and managed by financial oligarchs. But the SVB, the Silicon Valley Bank collapse, which is the result of many things, but it is not new. It is really a reminder of what happened in the bank crisis of 2008. Martin Wolf, the writer in the Financial Times, puts the crisis, the timeline of the previous crisis as 2007, 2015.
Right.
So it was a long financial crisis where the Fed and the Treasury did all they could to save the banks to the tune of something, well, conservatively, $9 to $10 trillion. Some have gone as high as to say it's over $12 trillion. And we're back at that again, where this time a medium-sized bank, where a lot of investors went because of the new regulations on the bigger banks, which were overturned, by the way, in the Trump administration. So these smaller banks like Silicon Valley Bank are unregulated and they're reckless, and they got caught in their own trap. That is to say, they had all of these government bonds which were worth less than they were when they first bought them because of the rising interest rates stimulated by the policy of the Federal Reserve because of their attempt to fight inflation. So the Silicon Valley Bank, and I'm certain others, Signature Bank, Credit Suisse,
Right.
In Switzerland, they have all these government bonds that are now worth less than they were at the time that they bought them.
Right.
And investors in the bank saw the bank as possibly collapsing and left the bank. And the stock in Silicon Valley Bank declined by something over 80%. So the bank collapsed, but other banks could collapse. And the question is, are we at the beginning of a long financial crisis, not unlike the 2008, which again, Martin Wolf says 2007 to 2000 and I think he says 15, but it's a long process of a crisis, and it took tremendous government investment and spending to save the big banks. And are we on the cusp of that once again? But this time, the consequences could be far more severe because of the fact that the federal government is now in debt to the tune of something like $31 trillion,
Right.
which is, 150% of the GDP. This is a big crisis. And you put on top of that the de-dollarization, where countries like Brazil and Saudi Arabia, not to mention Russia and India and China,
Right.
are leaving the dollar and using other currencies such as the Chinese yuan, and in the case of India and Russia, the use of the Indian rupee or the Russian ruble to handle their transactions, especially as it relates to oil. And then on top of that, the United States and the West are losing in Ukraine. So we're in a crisis, to put it mildly.
Yeah, for sure. You know, and not all of these things have fully matured. We're seeing the beginnings of the de-dollarization process. Substantial amounts of trade suddenly are being done, particularly in petroleum and other, minerals and et cetera. Those kinds of commodities. And the framework is being established, however, for an increasing share of that until ultimately the dollar is no longer the exchange currency of the world. And you're talking about some very large players are already getting their feet wet up to their ankles and perhaps their shins in this exercise. On top of that, you have a war between NATO and Russia basically taking place in Ukraine. And, today, Friday, the 31st of March, they're floating the idea of sending in, quote unquote, peacekeepers. In other words, a NATO army to defend Ukraine, Western Ukraine, to send it into Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And the UN Security Council spent at least an hour or two this morning excoriating Russia for announcing that they were going to position some of their nuclear weapons in Belarus, although the United States, that they call this a violation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty because Belarus is not a nuclear power, but they neglect to mention that the United States has been doing that for 30 years or 40, 50 years, really. In fact, the U.S. representative did note that they had been doing it at the time of the negotiation of the treaty in 1967, and that the U.S. has has nuclear weapons all across Europe already in countries that are supposed to be non-nuclear. And the situation on the ground in Ukraine is so fluid and so risky, and there's so many opportunities for escalation that all of this is taking place in a cauldron of uncertainty.
Yeah, and interestingly, or I should say ironically, part of the reason that we have a war in Ukraine is the Russians' objection to the stationing of NATO nuclear-capable missiles in Ukraine,
right?
Only 5 minutes away from the Kremlin.
Yep, they were talking about they mentioned that we want to do that, and that was what triggered the
Yes.
Russian operation.
Yes. In other words, another way to look at this, Don, this huge and now global crisis is a crisis made in Washington.
Yeah.
This is the result at one level of the profound and deep hubris and arrogance of U.S. neocons and policymakers who still believe that they're in the world of 1991,
right,
where they could proclaim that there was one superpower, and that was the United States, and we would dictate based upon a rules-based international order what other nations would do.
Right.
Things have completely changed, and really have changed qualitatively
Right.
since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where the U.S. thought they would invent a new Cold War, and the majority of nations, especially African nations, would side with the West. Well, it turns out to be almost the opposite.
That's right. We're looking at a situation at the UN where nations comprising more than half of humanity are standing with Russia or refusing in any event to stand with the United States against Russia. Tony, thank you so much for your time. And I'd like to develop this some more over the coming weeks, and so we'll speak with you again for sure.
Okay, thank you, Don.
For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.